Testing, testing, testing. We're checking the mic. Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. So glad to see you all here for our second session of the School of the Spirit class called Hope is Here, which is the title of Dr. Luther Smith's book that we are discussing. Highly recommend, if you haven't already gotten it, to purchase a copy. We also have one of the chapters copied in the registration link if you want to try that out first. But if those of you who were here last week know that Dr. Luther Smith is the emeritus professor of church and community at Candler School of Theology at Emory. He's also an ordained elder in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Did I get that right? Yes. This book is really the culmination of decades and decades of his teaching and writing and advocacy. So we're just so honored to have him here with us for these 3 weeks, and I will hand it over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you again. After last week and being again oriented to being part of the All Saints gathering, it's just been a delight to anticipate this kind of time. Last week we began in speaking about the meaning of hope in terms of something that's more than wishfulness and optimism, and the fundamental definition with which all of this goes forward for hope is a force of God that enlivens us to life. A force of God that enlivens us to life. And this force of God that enlivens us is not just enlivening us to our fulfilled wishes, but takes us to places that challenge us, to disrupt us, that cause anxiety at times for us, as well as joy, delight, and fulfillment. And perhaps the most fundamental question in the spiritual journey is, do I trust God with my life? Where God is leading me, is that sufficient? Or do I simply want a God who listens to me and knows how to follow directions? And this related to the spiritual discipline of contemplative prayer, which focuses upon the listening heart. How am I listening? Not just how am I speaking my heart's desires, and that's important, but how am I listening? And how am I discerning? And how am I engaging that to which I have heard? And prayer, therefore, is the ongoing process of listening, discerning, engaging. In that sense, it's unceasing. Because how we are living our lives become an expression of prayer. A faithful response to prayer, or not so much. This matter of the listening heart, the discerning heart, the engaging heart, this metaphor of heart is really fundamental to the faith journey. One of the definitions of faith itself It's not really about how am I following dogma or doctrine, but a fundamental definition of the word faith is the heart is in it. The heart is in it. And Jesus tells us to love God with all our heart. All our heart. I want to begin with a meditative reflection from Mary Oliver. I think we know Mary Oliver, especially in terms of her poetic reflections on matters of nature and engaging nature, how we are very much ourselves responding to the challenges of life, and the sense in which she helps us to understand that which we so frequently miss for lack of attention. This is a different kind of poem from Mary Oliver, and it's entitled Of the Empire. We will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, that tried to vanquish insecurity for the few and cared little for the penury of the many. We will be known as a culture that taught and rewarded the amassing of things, that spoke little, if at all, about the quality of life for people, other people, for dogs, for rivers. All the world in our eyes, they will say, was a commodity. And they will say that the structure was held together politically, which it was. And they will say also that our politics was no more than an apparatus to accommodate the feelings of the heart. And that heart, in those days, was small and hard and full of meanness. How do we understand our hearts? Certainly personally, but also collectively. And with this understanding, as was spoken last week, that God's dream for us is this dream of beloved community, where compassion and justice prevail. And it's possible to understand the whole biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation as one in which the theme of community is persistent. The quality of life, of the environment, yes, in terms of us being sustained by what is needed from us, the creative process of God and creation itself, and God's desire for a people who will be responsive to the God's dream for us. We hear this so clearly in the prophets, as was mentioned last week. We hear this so clearly in the narrative of what's happening to the people of Israel. We hear this so clearly in the message of Jesus. This matter of who we are becoming in a way that resonates with this dream of beloved community. And as I spoke last week, the book itself is very much focused on the understanding that the pursuit of justice and beloved community is truly only possible for sustaining us if we take seriously the disciplines, the spiritual disciplines of life. Anything where we are seeking to pursue excellence, fulfillment, entails disciplines, and we know this. I could continue to speak about that for quite some time, but I understand for conversation, I need to leave about 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm going to assume we know this. And if we don't, we'll talk about it in the 10 or 15 minutes. Anything that requires fulfilling excellence, or that which we know is to be in some way apprehended in its completeness or near completeness, entails discipline. And the spiritual disciplines have been part of all faith traditions, including ours. Prayer has been one. We spoke about that last week. Prophetic remembering is another. How can you simply remember the prophets fully by only quoting the prophets, reading the prophets, and yet at the same time somehow deciding we will go forth personally and collectively uplifting the prophets, but this whole thing about justice, that's really politics. No, well, yes, it is politics, but it's also our faith. Our faith. Our faith. Prophetic remembering. And it's not simply a case of remembering their names, the prophets' names, or even just remembering their messages, but remembering that they are calling us forth to fulfill what they themselves had sought for fulfillment and had failed to see fulfilled, but their hearts yearned for it. This is on us. This is our time to not just enact what the prophets have been saying, but to truly at the same time understand it's for our fulfillment. Since childhood, we have known this second discipline, that is crossing identity boundaries, and the importance of it. We have had some level of awareness and sensitivity about crossing other people's identity boundaries and about our own feelings when persons cross our identity boundaries. Each one of us is complex, with multiple roles and multiple identities that are expressed within different cultures that we claim. And yet, the term culture is often used to locate a person within a single culture that seems to most characterize the life of the person. So we come to see persons primarily in terms of their race, their ethnicity, their language, their economic situation, their status in the society. And in the effort to understand who others are, we note their physical characteristics and listen to their way of speaking, how they dress. Are they educated? Are their terms the terms I would use? Are they slang terms that perhaps diminish my sense of their being, really sophisticated? This occurs both consciously and subconsciously. And from the beginning of human community, it has been the case. Is this other person me, like me, or different from me? Is this person a member of my tribe? How likely is harmonious relationship with this person? How careful do I need to be with this person? Will it be easy or difficult for us to understand and respect each other? Who holds the most authority in this meeting? Identifying the social location or the cultural group of another and having conscientious understanding of that and their behaviors is something that is related to our sense of comfort and our desire to be engaged. And even with the identity labels we perceive and project onto another person, the person is always more complex than our conclusions. I am an African American with experiences both common and distinctive to many African Americans. I'm a Christian with a particular understanding of the Christian faith that would be at odds with many other Christians of the Christian faith. I can find myself more comfortable with people of other faiths than people who identify themselves as Christians. As you know, we are a faith that has a history of establishing bonfires, not just for hot dogs, but for other Christians who don't have the doctrine right. I am a heterosexual whose life is enriched by long-lasting friendships with persons who identify as lesbian, gay, and transgender. I am an American citizen who embraces my national identity, as I am also critical of my nation's oppressive and exploitive history and current impulses. We are all complex. And the moment someone thinks they have you figured out, you know, you don't like that. I know what you're going to say. It's what you've always said. I understand where you're going. I know you better than you think. And there is something terribly offensive about that, because I may not know myself as well as you think you know me. We do not like others to reduce who we are by their reflection on their experiences with us, and yet, we are a people who seek to define others, and at times ourselves, with such clarity as if the book on transformation is closed with us. I have lived too long to be thinking about, is there more to me than the 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years I have lived? Sometimes insight comes about the whole journey and how one has lived on one's deathbed. You see the opening lines of the death of Ivan Ilyich, whose life was understood to be the most ordinary and yet the most terrible. And Ilyich recognizes this as his daughter is going through this process and the joy of preparing for marriage, and he is dying, having attended to all that was necessary to succeed through the bureaucracy and achieve. And he looks back on his life and he realizes, what a mistake, what a mistake, what a mistake. No, the book on each of us is never closed. The question becomes, to what extent am I sensitive to this and responsive to this? How do I pay attention to my own identity boundaries, and how am I sensitive to others' identity boundaries? That which explains how we locate ourselves in society. What moves our emotions positively or negatively? Those factors about oneself that inform one's sense of purpose. How we describe ourselves in terms of how we want other people to know us. How we do not describe ourselves to people we do not trust, or who we do not consider to be candidates for a more intimate relationship. Sometimes we are clear about what constitutes our boundary identity, and there are times when describing our boundary identity is an effort. Sometime between now and next week, I would suggest giving yourself some contemplative time with a piece of paper and a pen or pencil, or at the computer, and just identify what for you describes your identity boundary. What are the characteristics that you understand are so crucial to your own sense of self? Name them as best one can, and be open to the time after you've put them down to perceiving there may be others than you've named. The extent to which you're satisfied with what's on the paper, or the feeling, there's something more to me than this, and I don't know if I can name it, but I'm going to try. Sometimes it's when we cross an identity boundary of another, or when someone crosses our identity boundary, sometimes we become aware of something we had not known about ourselves before. One of the exercises I have often done in retreat settings is ask people to list the 1 to 10, what constitutes for them their sense of identity boundary. And then I ask them, of the things on the list, what are the 5 most important elements of that list? And then I ask them to put it in order. And it is quite a travail in the retreat as people work with this. And it can be quite revealing to themselves how they've named some things that they've never named publicly before. Most often in a retreat setting, every African American in the group says, I am black. Most often in this retreat setting, very, very few will say, I am white. And then we talk about that. And some who have struggled to understand whether or not to list that, as well as those who didn't list it, would say, why didn't I name that when it's so important to everyone else? And then we have a discussion about what does it mean when you live in a society when you don't have the need or the felt need, when you perhaps have the privilege of perceiving your race as a factor that you don't have to think about. And then the conversation that follows. This matter of crossing identity boundaries entails hard conversations, and it entails for us, I think, opportunities for fulfillment beyond perhaps what we had envisioned. There's a lot more I could talk about if I had another hour, but we continue. So, with all of that said, I want to suggest 5 other disciplines that can help us when we cross a person's identity boundaries. Because the crossing of another identity boundaries, when we choose to do this, can be unnerving, fulfilling, perilous, healing. It has so many possibilities. And at times we are reticent about doing such a thing because we don't know if we're properly equipped. Are there trigger words which will set this person off that I have no idea about because of a trauma they may have lived? Or they have a sense of themselves such that, I'm not even familiar with the current terminology in which these people reference themselves. Am I really able to talk about my own identity with a person? And will I be able to be as forthcoming about the elements of my identity that are somewhat embarrassing as I am about the elements of my identity about which I am proud and so pleased? So, this is crucial for us to discern because crossing an identity boundary is how we arrive home. This is where we discover an experience of beloved community with another person and with other people that goes beyond our living secluded, isolated lives. It would be important to be able to list, as you're taking out a second sheet of paper, who are my closest friends, or who do I consider to be friends with? And to see what are the common characteristics of that list. Are they people of a particular social class, economic class, political way of thinking, racial group? Are they people of a particular language only? Are they people of one or many religions? Be interesting to look at your list of friendships and to recognize how there are these relationships that have distinctive characteristics with wonderful people and a delight in the friendships, and to at the same time recognize there have been some limitations on how I have cultivated friendships. And this isn't to say that we're trying to cross off on the list all the characteristics in humanity in order to say, you know what, I've crossed so many identity boundaries and I have a list to prove it. That's not the purpose. No, the purpose is to recognize perhaps how there are elements of fulfillment that I have not had in my life, and perhaps there are good reasons for that, perhaps there are self-serving reasons for that. Those are matters for the ongoing discernment that you have. But what does it mean when we characterize beloved community as compassion and justice and relationship with all of God's people? And we find that it's a very, very, very small list of characteristics that can almost be described as characteristics of comfort. You know how important friendships are? I mean, none of us can really make the journey of faith or the journey of life without them. We can endure times of loneliness, but we cannot endure a journey characterized by loneliness. And you know that friendships are not always a matter of smiles and laughter. That close friendships are not even a matter of we get one another. There are things that go on in your life, there are things that go on in a friend's life where you're continually having to assess, can we talk about this? Is this something my friend would want to hear? Will I lose a friendship over such disclosure? And how am I to talk about what I suspect this friend wants to talk about in a way that makes me very uncomfortable? You know, just friendship itself has these kinds of complications, and relationships with partners and spouses that have occurred over decades can have some dimensions like this. You know, in all the years we've been together, I've never really said this before, but there's something you do that really annoys me. Yeah. And even that introduction sets things off in a bad direction. But those things can be there, usually are, and we withhold the conversation for anxiety about what it means to talk about them. And we discover that perhaps engaging certain matters is really a matter of timing. Octavia Butler, one of my favorite authors, she has written, "Sometimes being a friend means mastering the art of timing. There is a time for silence, a time to let go and allow people to hurl themselves into their own identity, and a time to prepare to pick up the pieces when it's all over." So very quickly, these 5 spiritual practices to consider as being resources for crossing an identity boundary and available to us with all of the ups and downs, the healing, and at times the brokenness that occurs in our efforts. First, respect for the boundaries. Another, sensitivities, a slow approach. I was listening to someone who has given his life to animal behavior, and he said in the animal world, the basis for perhaps being related is a slow approach. That when animals see another approaching slowly, there is the chance for connection. But it's the racing up to another where all bets are off. What does that mean? And by a slow approach, I'm not talking about stalking. That's a but listening to another, rather than trying to convey to another how good you are at understanding what they're talking about. Or if they bring forth matters of their culture, where they've lived, where they grew up as a child, to not say to them, "Oh yeah, I get that. You know, I went on a cruise where we had a tour excursion to your country, and it was so interesting." But to listen and to let them speak about their own reality and to engage with a way of not feeling as if you're trying to impress them with how prepared you are for this conversation. Secondly, humility. To accept one's own lack of knowledge about a person and their people, and not seeking to relieve one's discomfort by securing information and thinking that will get you over humility, or being in control in relating process, because humility is not fundamentally about thinking less of oneself. That's not what this is. A basic understanding of humility is groundedness. I am grounded. And how are you grounded in your faith? How are you grounded in your identity? In such a way that you're not needing to exert the sense of being an authority, or exert the sense in which you are somehow compensating for your own lack of understanding by choosing to not be open-hearted and choosing to close your own heart. Third, open-heartedness itself, how someone experiences your welcome for crossing your identity boundary in a way in which you're able to accept that people perhaps distrust you for good reason. and to somehow accept that in a way that doesn't lead you to be pushing the issue of trust, where actually the issue of trust may in some way disclose itself over weeks, months, or even years of relationship. And fourth, carrying with you the gift of an apology. Because when we all have our tendency to do something wrong or to say something wrong, an apology can be really healing, as well as helpful. I will say to you that I have found liberation in saying to another, "I'm sorry I said that," rather than trying to justify why I said that, as well as concluding, "You should accept my good intentions. You're just too sensitive. You need to work on that." And last, cultivating a friendship and having the commitment to it, recognizing this is how I get home, this is how we get home. It's this cultivation of the friendship that is called upon us as people of the Christian faith, and we see it in our discipleship as we follow Jesus, who recruited 12 friends. Not just 12 who would continue the message of his ministry, that. Not just 12 students, but 12 friends. And not just, I would say, out of their need for him, but out of his need for them. Friends on his journey for laughter. Friends on his journey for conversation and reflection. Friends on his journey for prayer. Friends who didn't understand him so much of the time, especially as you read the book of Mark. Friends on his journey who he probably sensed long before they did that they were not going to pursue identifying with him after the travails that awaited him, even though they thought they would. But still, they were his friends. And even that time before his execution that was anticipated, he chose to do one of the most intimate things that occurs within the whole world of faith, but especially within the Christian faith, and that's table fellowship in that supper, to eat with them, to be with them. All of them. I conclude with a quote from Howard Thurman, and some of you know of my connection with Thurman, and I was here with you about Thurman. And Thurman says, "The experience of love is either a necessity or a luxury. If it be a luxury, it is expendable. If it be a necessity, then to deny it is to perish." So simple is the reality, and so terrifying. Ultimately, there is only one place of refuge on this planet for any person, and that is another person's heart. To love is to make of one's heart a swinging door. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luther. We have time for questions for about 5 minutes or comments. So just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic to make sure people watching online can also be a part of the conversation.
I wasn't here last week, but what is your relationship with Howard Thurman?
Oh, well, then I was referring to involvement in a class. I think we had 3 sessions about Thurman and his spirituality. I knew Thurman personally. I've written books on Thurman. Howard Thurman is really one of the mentors of Martin Luther King Jr. There's a documentary on Thurman you can find on YouTube that I think is helpful. It's called Backs Against the Wall. Thurman takes me places. He takes us places where this whole question of the spiritual journey is, I think, one in which we discover our hearts at rest and our hearts with a challenge that is worthy of them. Look Thurman up. Actually, Candler has, I think, most of his available meditations online for free. And you get to hear his voice and his messages. And he's listed in the Orbis books of modern spiritual masters as one of the spiritual masters of that series. His book, Jesus and the Disinherited, really informed the work of so many of those in the civil rights movement. And there's a book on 30 spiritual classics in which Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited is listed as one of those.
But you knew him?
Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness, that's a whole nother story. But I will say I first responded to hearing Thurman. And a year later, after reading as much as I could, I wrote him and asked if I could visit with him. And he said yes. And he gave the day to the visit. Thurman would have been probably 74 or 75 at the time. And out of that, a friendship developed and a relationship. But it was later that Thurman became a subject of my doctoral work and my ongoing research over these, it's now been over 50 years of working on Thurman. It was actually the first critical work on Thurman's thought, but since then, there are so many scholars who have come out with books on Thurman, and that was in part my reason for writing, to not exhaust the meaning of engaging Howard Thurman, but to discover how Thurman is a gift to the current century. It's like Alice Walker said, we as a people do not throw our geniuses away. And I think it's this kind of prophetic remembering of Howard Thurman that is vital to what we need, as well as to how we go about the journey. Thank you.
Our Jenny McBride mentioned this morning about how inappropriate any kinds of thoughts of supremacy, either national supremacy, racial supremacy, etc. And I've heard recently, in fact, I just saw a documentary on the son of, I think, Brian Dill Beckwith, the ones who killed Medgar Evers, and he considered that an act of self-defense. Apparently, that, have you heard that? That
I've seen the documentary.
Killing the 4 little girls in Birmingham church, bombing them, was an act of self-defense because it promotes. So have you heard that in terms of crossing identity boundaries? That seems to be a big one to cross.
Yes. It's taking Jesus seriously is not an easy thing. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, how do you do that without crossing an identity boundary? Do you only love your enemies from a distance? Do you only love your enemies by a kind of spiritual remote control? How do you have conversations with your enemies? How do you listen? How do you speak your heart? I think it's going to be important for us to be able to do that nationally in terms of a political landscape in which there's just, I think, too much understanding of dealing with enemies by either besmirching their character or dismissing them as somehow or another unworthy of our availability to be in conversation. It's not easy, and the question I would ask in response to what I think is a very difficult matter in terms of loving enemies is, how are we offered opportunities to understand how to do this? Because we get preached to and taught about a lot of things as to what we ought to do, but without any instruction on how to do it, such as forgiveness. How do you forgive? Not you, but how do we forgive when there is so much that has happened to us that we are justified in being angry about it? We have been traumatized by it. So how do we forgive so that we are not enslaved, imprisoned by bitterness? And I have been in the church all my life, and I have never received from the church instruction on how to forgive. I've been told to forgive. I've been told to love my enemies, but I've never had instruction on how to do it. And believe me, when I say instruction, I'm not talking about we'll have a seminar to respond to this. How do we have the kind of time that enables us to ask the questions in confidence as well as perhaps in public that enable us to move forward, such that we are discovering how forgiveness and loving the enemy, as challenging as it is for us. It is for us. Do I trust God with my heart? Do I trust God with the journey? Does God recognize how frail I am? Does God recognize how deep my hurt is? I think the spiritual disciplines are working on us in terms of our connection with God, the God of the journey. And we go forward with this understanding that we are not attending to this alone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you're like me, you're hungry for more after this, so I'm so glad that we'll be meeting right here again next Sunday.